joining us. Thanks for sharing your time. We're going to spend maybe 45 minutes or so, possibly an hour, but talking about all things BDD cucumber, best practices and anti-patterns, all right? Things to avoid, things not to do. And with a particular focus on kind of taking that into the test automation space as well. We're not going too much into kind of code from an automation point of view, but how we bring these things together. Okay. So yeah, I mean, BDD and Cucumber can add, extraordinary amounts of value to your delivery, to your organization. Okay, but having worked with this for 10 years now, we do see a number of examples, and it's easy to fall down in these areas, right? Some of these mistakes are very easy to make, but when some of these anti-patterns or these bad practices are, albeit unintentionally followed, the value, the value add of using processes like BDD and tools like Cucumber is diminished immediately. Okay. So they are prone to this misuse, and we do see it very, very frequently. Not intentionally, as we say, but the aim here is to take you through a widely accepted series of best practices and things not to do, or anti-patterns, things to avoid. Ideally, if you're just getting started with this, right? If you are just getting started, this is the ideal time to start embracing some of this stuff. Bringing it into your own process and trying to make sure that you adopt these as you move forward. Okay, let's get going. Of collaboration. Okay, so most commonly in the format of what's now known as a Three Amigos session or a Power of Three session. This is essentially a discovery for a new project. Okay, so we've got to have representatives from product ownership, or can be business analysts, or a combination of the two, alongside developers, alongside testers. And the primary objective is conversation between these three groups. Okay, communication, collaborating, working together, discussing, questioning the requirements. All right, testing the requirements verbally, probing, asking questions. What if this? In this particular edge case, what might happen? How should my application behave? Ultimately, then looking to build acceptance tests, automated acceptance tests to prove that functionality is being delivered. Okay, and in subsequent cycles of development, knowing that those regression tests are going to keep proving that functionally nothing has regressed. Okay, so these three groups get together. Okay, we've got to capture these agreed outcomes, and the format for that is what we call a BDD scenario. Okay, so BDD, behavior driven development. All right, so we're focused on the behavior of the user on our application. All right, so each of these three groups brings something a little different to the conversation. So product owners, quite obviously will bring the basis of a requirement, or basic intent, to this conversation. Developers clearly are then experts at driving the technical aspects of implementation, things to consider. And where the testers bring expertise is in wide, broad application knowledge of an existing application. Or for something completely new, the idea of exploring the edge cases and the boundaries, right? Asking the big questions, what if this, what if that? Thinking about negative conditions as well, which we'll talk about later. So at this early stage, the things to avoid are not having each of those three people present, right? That's a must to start doing this successfully. All right, now, if for any reason you've already missed that opportunity, the next kind of anti-pattern to avoid is then thinking that people can go away and write these features and scenarios in isolation. It's not going to work because you've missed that core aspect of conversation. All right. As is the situation, trying to write BDD scenarios after coding has already begun. That's not going to work. Retrofitting BDD scenarios to something that's already been developed definitely doesn't fit or support the model. Okay, again, you're missing out on that core component of conversation, probing the requirements, bouncing ideas off of each other and deciding what needs to be built and how it needs to be testing. All right. So understand that this is first and foremost a conversational methodology. All right. So if you're not conversing, you aren't doing BDD. Okay. As we get into this process of starting to document our BDD scenarios, the key thing to focus on, all right, is looking at the end-to-end journey that you wish this customer to undertake. Okay, we don't care about exactly how they achieve that. We want to focus on the user journey and the flow. Okay, that's the first thing. And the second thing to consider is the avoidance of combining multiple requirements. Okay, so we'll look at 2 or 3 examples here. So the basic rules for this, so we want to choose declarative capture of these scenarios rather than imperative. Okay, now what that means is essentially what we just said, talking about workflow rather than the specifics of interacting with the UI, for example. You know, which buttons did I click, which forms did I fill out? Okay, and then we definitely want to embrace singularity within our requirements. Okay, the golden rule is kind of single requirement, single scenario. Okay, so very much keep that in mind from the outset. With any good quality BDD scenarios, okay, anyone connected to the delivery or anyone within the business should be able to look at a BDD scenario and understand immediately what it is, what it's there for, and ultimately what it's trying to achieve. Okay, and genuinely speaking, that comes from short, concise, readable requirements. Okay, let's focus on the good example first here. Okay, so this is based on Amazon checkout flow. We have a 4-step scenario. Okay, so it does use an and keyword as well, and that's okay in moderation. But it says here, given an unregistered user is on the Amazon UK website, when they search for a product and add it to cart, then they are able to complete a successful checkout. Okay. Let's compare that to the top bad example. All right, so it starts in the same way. Given an unregistered user is on the Amazon UK website, when they click in the search field and enter headphones and click search, then they see a search results page. When they select a product, then they see a product details page. When they add a quantity of 2 and click on the add to cart, then they're able to complete a successful checkout. All right, so this shows you very clearly the difference between declarative, which was the good example, the kind of user flow based, versus imperative, which is, you know, narrating every single thing that user's doing, everything they're clicking on, every bit of text that they're entering. Okay, and really the worst thing about that is that when you add all these extra steps, you start to lose the immediacy of that scenario. You can no longer look at that and understand, you know, in an instant what's being done there, okay, because there's too much detail. All right, so what we say is that level of detail we take a level further down within the framework, within the automation tests. All right, this should sit within our step definitions, which we'll talk about shortly. The other thing with having that level of detail in your scenarios, as you can probably understand, if there are bugs or there are intended changes in the front end workflow or user journey for that customer, they will then break your scenarios. Okay, so if, for example, you no longer saw a particular search results page, the tester, you know, in this instance, would then have to go back and remove that step from this bad BDD scenario because that step itself is no longer relevant. But when you have a good scenario that's focusing purely on process, that layer of detail, that level of detail sits a layer down, and we can manage the change at that level, and our scenarios can remain untouched and as we originally drafted them. Okay. Now the final bad example there is just focusing on the fact of in this situation, the author has added another requirement. All right, so they've combined a second requirement. So we have the same thing as the first good example, but they've added and they can then register as a new user. Okay, so this is now 2 requirements. It should be 2 scenarios. Okay, so we want to avoid that as well. So we can now start looking at some additional aspects, things that can be added to BDD features and scenarios. Okay, but let's focus on the core, the jobs, if you like, of these given, when, then keywords. All right, so start by understanding that your given should always really represent a starting state. Or a starting set of circumstances for that user journey. Okay, the when step would always or should always be a series of definitive user actions to undertake the majority of the flow under test, if you like, and the then step is going to be some kind of verification, an assertion. Again, can be positive or negative, asserting that something has happened as expected or something that you don't want to happen hasn't happened. Okay, what we want to do as well essentially is use grammatically correct, concise, natural language, as we say, and that's going to come from that discovery, that Three Amigos session. Okay, and we can inject basic business terminology, not jargon, not buzzwords, as required. Okay, only if it adds something of relevance to that scenario. There's two examples we're going to look at here, okay, because we're going to now bring into the conversation the idea of enhancing your scenarios with tense, okay, past, present and future tense. Now you've really got two options here. So this first example, okay, this is okay, but it's not got great tense usage, all right. So given I will go to the Amazon UK website, that's like a future tense. When I searched for a product and added it to cart, that's past tense. Then I can complete a successful checkout, kind of focusing on the present tense there. So that's not horrendous, but it can be it can improve much further. So there's two schools of thought. One is that you look at a past tense for your given step, you look at a present tense for your when steps, and you look at a future tense for your then step. All right, that's one thing to think about. Or you can use a present tense all the way through. Okay, so these aren't critical, but they just help to make your scenarios a little bit more readable, grammatically correct, and they can enhance them in a nice way. Okay, so what would that become? That would become: given an unregistered user went to the Amazon UK website, past tense. When they search for a product and add it to cart, present tense, then they will be able to complete a successful checkout, future tense. Okay, so from a tense point of view, that's probably an optimized scenario there. Okay, what we see on this example as well, there's two things we've added. We've added the idea of a narrative. So underneath a feature, you can add a one-liner or a short paragraph that may be of use to add a little further context to that feature file. Okay, so here I've just kept it very, very simple. As a user, I wish to check out with a product I've chosen. Okay, so it's purely descriptive, it's free text. You can choose to include that or not if you feel it adds value. And then the idea of background steps. Okay, so background steps, if you only have one scenario in a feature, you're not going to want to use a background step. All right, if you've only got the one scenario, then you will want to make that step part of your core scenario. Okay. In this example, I'm assuming I've got multiple checkout related scenarios. They're all going to start with the same step, which is given an unregistered user went to the Amazon UK website. And because of that, I can convert that to be a background step within my feature file. And that means that every single scenario in this feature will run that as the first step before it then runs the core steps of the scenario itself. So in the case of this scenario, that then starts with the when step, if that makes sense. Okay, there are two other keywords, and but. We can see that we've used an and here, so sometimes that just gives you a little bit of separation, because it was better to use that and keyword in this instance rather than saying when they search for a product and add it to cart. Okay, we want to try and separate that. We can do that with an and keyword. Definitely don't want to overuse it. And there is a but keyword as well, which almost implies an alternative result or a negative result to check. I would say that's probably the least used keyword in the majority of features and scenarios that we see. But use and but in moderation would be the key advice there. The other thing, finally, we've done in this example, we've used the third person tense for the core scenario there. So given an unregistered user, when they, then they, okay? As opposed to first person, sometimes you see these scenarios given I, when I, then I. The reason for that, when we use third person, we can start to talk about the role that that person has. So in this case, we said they're an unregistered user. In another example, we might refer to them as an administrator, for example. So that would be my personal preference because it helps me to clearly distinguish the type of user that is undertaking this workflow. All right, so some things to think about there. So with a traditional testing background, okay, testers will always think about both positive and negative behaviors, okay? Now, as we know, this is about conversation. This is not fundamentally a testing exercise, but this is something that the tester will bring to that discovery conversation, all right? So it's a really good idea to draft features and scenarios that incorporate negative behavior as well, okay? So, the idea of capturing, definitely the things that should happen, that's your positive expectations, as well as the things that shouldn't, or certain error conditions, okay? As we say here, in the event of certain circumstances, how do we expect the application to fail successfully or fail gracefully? And that's where these edge cases, these what if questions, if a user tries to do this and they don't have the prerequisite order, for example, or the order's in the wrong state, what happens in this situation? And then the idea of error messages as well, having requirements for specific error messages that the user will see in the event that they trigger these errors, and then ultimately having automated tests that prove that to be true. All right. So there's a couple of examples here. Again, these are short scenarios, okay, kind of written in the third person. But in this first example here, our then step or our assertion is checking for an error condition. Okay, so then an error message is displayed with a call to action for the user. In this particular example, so I'm passing in a document string to the then step, and this is a front end error message that my automated test will assert the presence of. Okay, so incorrect organization, username or password. All right, so that's quite a simple example. The example below there actually is what we call a scenario outline. We're going to talk about this in a short while as well, but this is the idea of starting to data drive your scenario with multiple sets of data. Okay, now I've picked this example as it combines a scenario and we have a then step in the middle in this instance, okay, because we're really we're just calling an API in this situation, okay, so there's not too much kind of application interaction, so it can be a even more concise scenario, okay, but ultimately my assertion is that then I receive the correct response from the endpoint in case of success and failure, okay, but what I'm then doing, I'm driving different values when I call that API, when I call that endpoint, all right. So in the given step, you can see that I'm passing through a version of the API, an expected response, a label and a category. And really it's the expected response, which you can then see in the table below. So we've got a combination there of 201s, 400s essentially. So 400 being a negative condition and 201 being a success. All right, so I'm able to combine this idea of checking for positive and negative outcomes in the same scenario, with the use of scenario outlines and cucumber tables examples that essentially iterate the same test with multiple rows of data. Okay, so use your discovery session, your power of 3 sessions to focus on negative behaviors, error conditions, and unexpected responses as well. That should absolutely be part of the conversation. So working on one particular delivery, I had a fantastic experience on working with a Mexican client, okay. And as a team, we had a discussion and we decided, and this is something that Cucumber offers, is the ability to draft scenarios in different languages. All right, so we worked with a Spanish implementation effectively. So you can see my scenario here, as we're becoming familiar with here, my Amazon checkout flow. Okay, so My given when then in Spanish becomes dado, cuando, entonces. All right, so now, many customers, many European customers or South American, there's a good chance they'll speak very good English. Okay, but you can't always assume that. And what this did, this really enhanced the buy-in of the customer in terms of collaboration, enthusiasm for delivery, working with us as a delivery partner. It skyrockets that buy-in and that enthusiasm, when you can embrace that local language. Much more inclusive. Okay, so what we ended up doing, if you're using a tool like Jira for your as your requirements repository, your requirements management, your stories, we simply had Jira tickets that referenced both an English version and a Spanish version. Okay, so we still ran a discovery session, and we probably worked on the English versions of the requirements first of all. But then subsequently, once that had been approved by the entire team, we then introduced a Spanish version. And so that was really, really useful for ongoing collaboration, and really bringing the team together. So it's something that Cucumber offers by way of implementation. So yeah, as we say here, if you're working with a Spanish customer, why not use Spanish? Or a Norwegian customer, use Norwegian. It's an option that you have, and I would recommend you embrace it if you get the chance. One thing I definitely want to talk about is this idea of scenario step reuse. Okay, now my point here would be, don't force the reuse of scenario steps for the sake of automation convenience. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about that. We took a step that may be a common step to a number of tests or a number of scenarios, which was to essentially go to the website, or in this example here at the top, given an administrator logs into the application. All right, now this is kind of an obvious example where if you've drafted that step within your first written BDD scenario, and then you're drafting subsequent scenarios, it probably makes absolute sense that you could reuse that scenario step in subsequent examples. Okay, and that's okay, right? If it doesn't break the readability or the integrity, the logical flow of the BDD scenario, because we have seen examples where you start drafting a BDD scenario, given a when, a then step, and then out of the blue, because you want to your user flow or your automated test to follow a certain sequence of steps, and that you've already got a scenario step which does that. Out of the blue, then all of a sudden this kind of random step appears in a new scenario in a place that just doesn't make sense when you're looking at the scenario and you're reading the scenario. It will absolutely make sense in terms of how it interacts with the application in the automated test, because it will flow and it will do the things that the tester was expecting of that automated test. But because you just effectively lifted and shifted that scenario step from one scenario into another, just because it does a certain thing, there's a strong chance that inserted in the wrong place, it's just not going to make sense in the wider context of that scenario. Okay, so step reuse is fine if you don't break the logical flow of that BDD scenario, or if you don't break the readability, as we say. All right. Point 3 here, right? So in your discovery sessions, just go with the conversation, go with the flow. That's the most natural outcome from these sessions, all right? So just capture the natural language, because the alternative to step reuse is simply we create another given step or another when step, and effectively it is going to do the same thing. Well, that's fine. We'll just take the underlying step definition implementation, the sequence of actions on the application, and we'll create a new step definition, but we'll use that same sequence of actions. That's not a problem. The test will work in the same way. And you've got a new BDD scenario that reads exactly as it should, based upon natural language. All right. So I would say, don't disrupt this flow of your discovery sessions. Okay. Don't go looking around for a step that you once wrote that you think might do a thing that you now need it to do. Okay. This is what we call, step reuse for automation convenience, and it's not really in anyone's best interests. There is a school of thought that says it's positive for code maintainability. Okay, but one thing we're going to talk about is, in loose terms or high level terms, is the page object model. Okay, so we don't need code reusability or maintainability at the scenario level. That's not the chief objective. That will always be about the conversation. We can manage code maintainability elsewhere in the automation framework, and we will do that. Okay. And then finally, step reuse, as we say here, it's often cited as this antidote, to keeping in control of your step definition files or having manageable files. And that's fine as an aspiration, but never at the expense of your best quality, your readable scenarios. Okay. On to step definition file. Managing your step definitions files, keeping a handle on them, keeping them maintainable. This is an interesting concept, all right, because the very premise of step definition files, these are unique to tools like Cucumber, all right. It's the middle layer between your business layer, which are your features and your scenarios, and then your underlying code implementation, which in any language or with a page object model is going to be your page classes, your methods on those pages, and your page elements. But your step definition is the middle layer sandwiched in between those two. Because of that, there are different ways that you can manage and you can organize this, and there is definitely no one size fits all. There's no definitive best practice on this particular topic, all right? And as we say here, it is probably the least talked about aspect of working with a framework like this when it comes to implementing your automation tests. All right. So yeah, we've actually got here that's a one-liner, a two-liner from the Cucumber documentation, right? So technically, it doesn't matter how you name your step definition files or which step definitions you put in a file. You could have one giant file containing all your step definitions. However, we recommend creating a separate file for each domain concept. Okay, so I think, and here's a living example in the middle here. So this is from one of our own projects. Let's just reel off a few of these. Okay, so I guess the first thing to note, we actually have the step definitions directory, which sits within the features directory. Okay. And then you can choose to add directories within that step definitions file, as we've done in some instances, or of course you can just have your files at that level. So we've obviously grouped some admin UI step definitions together in that folder. We've probably grouped some price tier changes step definitions in that directory. But at a singular level, we've got things like audit steps. We've got a step definition file for our background steps. We've got a step definition file for our client admin steps. All right, so that's just one example. I guess that that would probably go along with the Cucumber concept of organizing our step definitions by domain concepts. I think that's probably an example of that. But there are other options, and we've seen different variations on this. So you can link a step definition file to a feature, so a kind of one-to-one relationship there. New feature, new step def file. You can manage them by size. Okay, so you might put them all into one step def file up to a point. Let's say 600 lines off the top of my head. And then you decide you need a new step definition file, number 2, and then you start putting all your step defs in there. That's another way. You can organize them by your application. If it's a web app, the page, or a mobile app, the screen. That may be a way that makes sense to your delivery team. You could do it by given, when, then steps. You may have all of your given steps, all of your starting states within a single step def file, your when steps and your then steps in their own step def files. There's nothing technically wrong with doing it that way. Or finally, you may do it by kind of user and application behavior. Okay, so Maybe we have a step definition file that focuses on the user navigating the app, okay, getting from point A to point B. Maybe we then have a step def file for everything that's to do with verifying or asserting a particular condition. So there's a variety of ways you can do it. Okay, as you can see, no one size fits all or best practice. When it comes to this, it's Cucumber and the like specific, and you and your team are going to have to find the way that makes most sense to you. And you'll probably go through different iterations of this on different projects. But there's some options for you there. Now we can start to look a little lower in the framework, in the code level. All right, so we've already mentioned or kind of made reference to this concept of the page object model, okay, as probably the preferred way of maintaining your code rather than forcing the reuse of step definitions. We talked about this a little earlier. All right, so the ultimate way to maintain your code is to use the page object model. So this is originates from Selenium WebDriver, okay, in conjunction with your step definitions. All right, so we've got an example on the left here. So this is a given step, okay. What we have in the given step is the sequence of actions that are going to be undertaken on the application. All right, so we do a few things there. We define a user, but essentially we open a page, we log in, we click on a drop down, we open the organization settings, we visit another page, we click on a test project, we click on the settings button, etc., etc. Okay, but what you'll see with all of these, I'm not referring to the browser in any of these. Okay, so I'm not instructing WebDriver to do anything, or my browser driver within my step definition itself, because I'm using page classes. Okay, so I have a page class called tenanted page. I have a page class called header page. I have a page class called projects page. And then in fact, let's focus on projects page. Okay, so within that page class, I then have a method called click test project. So my page object model tells me that that method will only sit on that page class. And then you can actually see that method on the right hand side now, okay? And this method is going to use page elements that only exist within that page class as well. And the page class typically represents a page in the application under test as well, or a large area of functionality like a header or a footer. Okay, and so we then have page elements. Okay, so I've got something there called the choose project header. Okay, so that is a page element. All right, but the core lesson here is that if we combine this page object model with our step definitions, so we have our given step and then we refer to the page and the method, and sometimes we're passing arguments in there as well. But what you end up with is it's almost like a manual testing script at this level. Okay, so you can see this middle layer of the framework. All right, bearing in mind that the features and scenarios at the top, or the business facing layer, this is the middle layer. But even at this middle layer, it's still very readable. All right, so you can read that and it's almost like a manual testing script. Okay, so this is how we would advocate that you think about code maintainability. All right, so it does keep the step definitions readable. Sorry. If I had a raft of low-level browser driver type code here, you wouldn't have that readability. The test would still work, but you certainly wouldn't have the readability. All right. So if reusability of step definitions, we've talked about it, but if that was an aspiration of your team, this also aids that. Okay. And then ultimately what we see is that your code maintenance, as we say, resides at a page class and a method level, rather than kind of forcing the reuse of steps, if you like. Okay, so this is definitely how we would advocate you structure that code. Step definition, page classes, methods on pages, and then working with elements that are only on those pages. All right, and that all comes from the page object model, which stems from the use of Selenium WebDriver. We can now start to think about data driving tests. All right, so Cucumber offers us something called a scenario outline. And you use a scenario outline when you wish to data drive your test with the use of examples. Okay. So we'll talk about that in just a second. I think a couple of key things here. In any automation framework, you want to be focusing on test independence. Okay, so I want each of my scenarios within a feature, and I want, where I am using examples and scenario outlines, I want each of them to be completely self-sufficient. Okay, they have access to the data that they need, they can set things up, they execute, they verify, and then they tear down and they tidy up after themselves. Okay, so that's just a good practice of any automation framework. You don't at any stage want one test that depends upon the outcome of another, because clearly if that first one fails, then the second one is not going to have what it needs. All right, and I think with the idea of data driving, parameterizing in this way, only do what you need to do, right? You've got to focus, drive the values that are instrumental to the purpose of the test, to allowing the test to do what it needs to do. What we're seeing here in this particular example is a very simple one, and we've got 3 arguments that we're working with in each example. And to be fair, the subscription type, we're just working with one type. Now that might say free or pro or evaluation, for example, but these all just happen to be free. The currency, we're just working with 2 currencies here, but of course that could be euros, it could be rupees, whatever. Singapore dollars is, we've got US dollars and GBP sterling here. But actually there's a bit more variance in the count section. All right, so this is typically, we're doing some kind of boundary value analysis type testing here. Okay, so what happens if I do a count of 0, 1, 21, 200, 1001, -1. So again, it's this is kind of true boundary value analysis from a kind of traditional testing background. But it does mean I get significant reuse out of a scenario. So the scenario still reads really nicely. Okay, so that came from a discovery session, developers, product owners, testers. And then because of the way we choose to implement it in Cucumber with an outline and with the use of examples, I get maximum reuse from that, okay, in a way that will be output to all of my reporting as well. Now, the caveat to this, whilst this is a 3-step scenario, given when then, and for all the good reasons we've discussed, keeping it nice and clean, short, punchy, concise. If I start adding too many rows of data or too many fields within each of those rows of data, so I have this big unmanageable grid of data, it has exactly the same effect of just having too many steps in my test. It makes it unreadable, okay, and to the point that actually there's so much data iteration going on there that no one's really sure of what this test is trying to prove or what this scenario is. So use data driving to good effect, parameterize what you need and no more so that the test can do what it needs to do. But you still want someone to be able to look at this and understand what the scenario is doing. The examples have the benefit of demonstrating the extent of your test coverage, so that's a nice benefit there. But again, make it manageable. Don't overdo it. Okay. So if we now start to think about runtime, okay, test execution. So we've seen the use of features with scenarios. We may have multiple scenarios on a feature. Some of those scenarios may be scenario outlines using examples. But I want to draw your attention to the fact that the majority, if not all, of kind of BDD supporting automation frameworks, when you activate multi-threaded test running, so what I mean by that is I want to run 10 tests concurrently, for example. Firstly, if the framework supports that, but assuming it does, when you activate that, most frameworks will split the workload at a feature level. All right, so let's just explore what we mean by that and why we care. All right, so we've built up a suite of features and scenarios from our discovery. We've created automated tests for them. What we mean is that those 10 threads, when they're running, they are going to look at how many features there are. Let's say there are 300 features, And very approximately, they're going to divide that amongst themselves, and they're going to pick up 30 features each. All right, so that's an approximation, but that's broadly how it works. So you can start to see that when we want to optimize our test execution, you want to try and balance the load across the threads. Okay, and I say that as much as is practical. A feature has a purpose. It came from a discovery. It contains scenarios that are that have been contributed to and reviewed and approved by your delivery team. So again, we can't do this for automation convenience, runtime convenience, at the expense of the feature scenario integrity. But some basic, as much as you can, a couple of guidelines or things to think about are trying where possible to keep a kind of balanced number of scenarios across your feature files. Okay, that's one aspect. And similarly, at a slightly lower level, a balanced use of scenario outlines with corresponding examples across your feature files. If you don't, what you may find is that you have, one thread picks up a particular feature, and that feature has 100 scenarios in it. Okay, well, that one thread is going to be tied to that feature, running those scenarios sequentially. Some of those may be scenario outlines. It will take even longer. So that one thread is going to be tied up, and it's going to be running a long, slow process because it's got an undue kind of burden of the workload, if you like. So as I say, I make the point that this is a practical exercise where you can, but definitely not at the expense of pulling apart your features purely for runtime convenience. If scenarios need to be in a feature because they're related to that core area of functionality. But if there is an opportunity to kind of split things out and balance the workload, then you should absolutely take that opportunity. Okay. One thing I want to caution against, and to be honest, I don't even know if this is still possible. All right, this is something we saw not that long ago. It's this concept called nested steps or steps within steps. That was something you could do with Cucumber. You may still be able to. I'm not sure. We definitely don't, and I'll explain why. Firstly, I'll tell you what it is. We can see an example on the left here. All right, so we're familiar with the given, when, and then now. Okay, this is our Amazon checkout. Written like that, that's a nice kind of good quality scenario. Now, you certainly used to be able to, maybe you still can, incorporate those within an overarching step, so you can start to see steps within steps. And again, this was really only ever about automation convenience. So if I know that that given, when, and then are doing a certain thing, they're achieving a certain end result, and I just want to shorten something, either I've got a new step, like the given I complete an Amazon checkout, I've just got one liner. There was this, there was a period of time when people would simply bring in these existing given, when, then steps into another wrapping step, if you like, as you can see here. It was something you could do. And there was a time, and even the Cucumber architects at that point said, this was something we wish we had never done, okay, because it was absolutely horrendous for troubleshooting a failing test if something wasn't working, okay, because you've got so many wrappers around wrappers. It was purely about automation convenience, okay. There was no benefit to a product owner or a business stakeholder here. They would much rather see the given, when, then step that they defined originally, okay, and now someone's trying to wrap it up within an overarching single step, okay. So it was never about the benefit of the business. It was never something that came from the discovery, and it really was a kind of a copy and paste automation convenience artifact, if you like. So disclaimer, I don't know if you can still do it. Certainly in earlier versions of Cucumber you could do. I don't even know if that was supported in all kind of language bindings. But if you find you can do it with the framework you're using, I highly recommend that you don't. Okay, because there's nothing good that can come from the use of nested steps or steps within steps. Okay. So let's talk about hooks. Hooks are incredibly useful within a Cucumber-based framework Four types we're going to talk about today is we've got before, before all, after, and after all. And we've got some examples there. So quite simply, a before all hook is something that will happen before every single test, every single scenario outline example that you may or may not use. All right, it's something that's going to happen before every one of those. Okay, a before hook, it will be something that's called before a particular test, or something that calls for that before hook specifically, which we'll see how you do in a second. Okay, after all, as the name would suggest, is something that happens after every single scenario outline, example, etc. And again, an after hook is something that will be called for by a specific test. So I'm running a certain test, I want to run this particular after hook. Okay, so generally speaking, we use a before or a before all hook in order to give ourselves a clean starting state for all of our tests, or for particular tests that need a certain thing. And then likewise with the after or the after all hooks, generally speaking, we're going to use these for test tidy up, tear down, clearing up after ourselves in order to keep our environments clean and performant. Okay. So location wise, so these would sit within a hooks file, okay, within our support directory, which will sit within our features directory within a Cucumber based framework. Okay, so three examples here. So you can see that I have a before hook. So it has a tag reference there. Okay, so that tag is at apply underscore payment underscore method. So this before hook will be called by any of my Cucumber scenarios that have that tag. Okay, and quite simply, it's doing two things. Again, method based, but it's these are helper methods. It's logging in and applying a payment method, and then it is instantiating a new browser. All right, so, but it's the use of that tag by a test that calls this before hook as the first thing that it does. I'm going to drop to the bottom one now. There's an after hook, and again it uses a tag. So any scenario that has this, in this case, this delete time clocks tag, will execute, and then we'll call this after hook. All right, so we work with Stripe, and we're using some Stripe functionality, and yeah, that's exactly what this is. This is a tidy up exercise. So when I run a test that calls for delete time clocks, I use the Stripe API and I delete a time clock that I was using for that particular test. I'm just tidying up after myself. Okay, I'll do some logging there as well. So testevolve.log.info, and I output some stuff to the console. So I reference the the clock and the ID, and I say, yep, this has been deleted. Okay, and then I do rescue a standard error. So if for any reason that clock's already been deleted, it can't find it, it won't fall over. It's just going to output to the console and say, look, I tried to do this, but there was nothing there, or the hook failed. Okay, but these are the kind of things you can do in your hooks. And then finally, I guess the shortest one, the most concise. So after all, so after every single scenario outline example in my test pack, I'm calling this method on the emails class that just says delete email, and then it's mentioning a specific email ID. Okay, again, so we use a particular mail server, so we want to keep that inbox as manageable, as empty, as clean as possible. So after every single test, if I've registered a user, for example, in my particular application, then it's going to fire a registration email into that inbox. I'm probably going to extract something, a registration token from that email, use that in my test. But then when the test is done, I then want to get rid of that email. Again, it's just managing my environment. All right, so this is how we can use hooks to do that. I mentioned tags there as well, right? So this is actually how you start to use tags. So here's a scenario. Now this scenario's got 4 tags on it. I've got, they all begin with the @ symbol, and I've got KYI_2179 and 2183. So as you can see, both of those refer to a Jira ticket or a requirement reference. Okay, so this starts to give me traceability back to my requirements repository, which can be very useful. as we just saw, my at delete underscore customer underscore org is a type of afterhook. So this scenario specifically is calling for that afterhook to be executed. Okay. And then the fourth or the third type of tag that I've got is criticality or priority, if you like, severity, whatever you use on your team. But this is the type of tag that I can use to include or exclude certain tests from runtime. All right, so we have a Jenkins pipeline that calls for just the critical tests to be run. Now, maybe I've got 1,000 tests and maybe I've tagged 100 of them, 10% of them as at critical. So when it comes to runtime, I've got two jobs. I've got one that just does the critical and one that runs everything. So the job that runs the criticals is looking for scenarios that have that tag. All right, so this is generally speaking how we use tags. So really, really useful to do different things with your tests, either before, during, or after your tests. Okay, but generally speaking, we link to source requirements, traceability, and we denote risk or criticality, and we manage the execution of our before or after hooks, as we've seen. So I'm going to wrap up by kind of looking at some of the outputs of our testing, if you like. Okay, so we talked about maybe having a CI/CD pipeline, using something like Jenkins, for example. Okay, one of the overarching benefits of using BDD as a process, as a methodology, going right back to the beginning, this conversation with developers, testers, product owners, one of the massive value adds is at the end of the testing cycle. Okay, if you work with a testing framework and you work with a reporting platform that outputs test results with reference to features and scenarios and steps, what you end up with is this full traceability from start to finish. Okay, I'm showing you our reporting platform here called Test Evolve Halo. Okay, but on the top there, what you'll see is real-time reporting at a features level. Okay, so if we're running 1,000 tests, real-time in the sense that as soon as we have a single result for just one of those 1,000 tests, it starts pushing data to this platform, and then we can start to click in and drill down. So at a top level, we have metrics, core automation metrics, if you like, numbers of scenarios that have passed or failed, progress, time taken, average scenario time, that kind of thing. We have our run properties. But actually where this becomes useful for the business and from a traceability back to source requirements perspective is on the right-hand panel there, where we start to talk about or representing results at a feature level, a BDD feature level. Okay, again, you're demonstrating the latest perspective on quality in a particular environment, talking in those common business terms that came from those discoveries with the developers, the testers, and the business owners. All right, so people see this and they understand what it is. They understand the function and they understand that it's being tested, and they get to see a result, right there and then. If you click into one of those, what you then see here is a test run report, the bottom image there. Okay, so what you see there is that you have your feature, all right, so your create an organization admin feature, and we can see that on the screenshot above. So this is the click through. We can see at least two scenarios there within that feature, the get organizations scenario and the get an organization by ID scenario. We can see their past, of course, but within those, we can see reference to the steps as well. So I see my given, my when, and my then step. And on the then step for the second scenario, I even see some example table input there as well. Okay, so this can really then serve as your living documentation, right? And it gives you that requirements traceability. So everyone on delivery knows exactly where you are at any point in time, but you have to use a test reporting format that supports the presentation of features and scenarios from an automation point of view, if that's to be achieved. Okay. Now let's talk about the idea of our tests. We spent a long time talking about BDD and ultimately crafting tests, okay? But quite simply, your tests have a job to do, right? Your tests need to provide a service to you. You are your test's customer, if you like, all right? And you, as a test manager or a testing practice owner, whatever it is, you have your own customers, all right? So your testing team, the management of your team, has a service to provide to your customers, your stakeholders, all right? So quite simply, once you've spent all this time crafting your requirements, building your scenarios, automating your tests, standing up your CI/CD pipeline, executing your tests, looking at the results. Those tests have to remain relevant, all right? So you either need to fix them or you've got to retire them. When a test fails, it's either because there's a regression and there's a genuine bug that needs to be raised. All right, so you can do that. But there will be other times, especially if you're testing through the UI, when the test has not run as expected, or it's been maybe flaky, this idea of a flaky test. So your job as an agile tester, immediately after that test run, either fix that test or retire that test if it's no longer fit for purpose. All right. Now, when I say retire as well, I don't mean just completely remove from your framework, from your automation project. Keep them there, but don't run them anymore, okay, until they are either that feature, if that feature's been removed from the application, we know that product owners can change their mind. So it may well come back in 4 sprints time. So there's no massive benefit of just deleting everything, okay. I mean, obviously we have, we'll probably be checking these tests into source control. So we can version control our automation project as well. But the simpler option, and maybe the cleaner option to start with until you're absolutely sure, is to simply tag those tests as something that you don't wish to currently run. All right. But one way to look at this now, think about where you are in your testing maturity, your agile automation maturity, right? So if you were called upon right now, firstly, could you immediately run a critical set of tests? Could you press the button now and have those tests executing against any target environment of your choice, right? That's the first question. The second thing to think about, are you getting consistent running and performance of those tests, all right? Have you ironed out any performance issues? Have you addressed any flaky tests to the point that they are now doing exactly what they need to do, all right? And that's all well and good if you've then got quick and clear reporting off the back of that, all right? As we talked about, if you've got a reporting platform that gives you traceability to feature, to scenario, to steps, that's so much better than a framework that simply says you ran 1,000 tests and 800 passed and 200 failed. What that doesn't give you is context. What that doesn't give a product owner is any picture of risk, okay, which is going to bring me on to my final point in a second. And does your reporting give you a full failure kind of breakdown, stack trace, diagnostics, etc., to help you as a tester analyze that failure as quickly as possible, okay? Because the job that you've got to do, or the service you've got to provide as a test manager, ordinarily, is a yes or a no. Can we release this to production in the next hour, Mr. Test Manager, right? So can we do this right now? I want you to tell me what our tests are currently telling us. Okay, this is the ultimate measure of your kind of agile readiness, if you like. Taking yourself through this checklist and understanding where you are in that process. Okay, because this should be the aspiration of an agile testing team with high levels, 70, 80% automation, and it's absolutely achievable as well. So, set this as a goal. Finally, I just want to talk about the idea, and maybe this is something I should have spoken about at the very beginning, but once we've been through this discovery session with testers, developers, product owners, before we think about writing code or automating anything, there's a chance to just take stock here and actually test the scenarios themselves, all right? In the wider kind of testing world, this is known as requirements testing, if you like, as well. But it can absolutely be applied to 10 features that have just been defined with 10 scenarios in each. All right. So this is a check that you can go through every scenario and ask these questions. And ultimately, what we're trying to see is is this deliverable in its current format? Can we as a team deliver this? Okay, so that's really the last question there. So is it deliverable? Okay, and it says if everything above is true, then consider your requirement to be deliverable. So let's consider what comes before that. So is it complete? What we're saying there is, don't be working with placeholder requirements, placeholder scenarios. Take the time to work with devs, testers, product owners, to work on complete requirements. Okay, when you know you've got a definite requirement with a given, a when, and a then step, you've got a definite outcome. Okay, unless it's complete, let's not have it in that requirements repository. Right, is it ambiguous? Okay, so have we avoided the buzzwords, the jargon? Do the three amigos, okay, do they all understand what's required? Okay, is it singular? We talked early on in this session about keeping scenarios singular. Single requirement, single scenario is kind of the cardinal rule. Okay, so avoid the twinning. We saw a bad example where we had a good kind of checkout flow, but then we bolted onto the end the requirement to then register the customer as well. Well, that's not necessarily. Make them two separate scenarios. Okay, so keep things singular. And then finally, more so from a testing point of view, is it now testable? Okay, with all of the above being true, does it document for me as a tester a clear and measurable outcome to determine success? Again, success could be a negative condition, right? Did I get the error condition I expected? More often than not, it's going to be a positive outcome, like a successful checkout. All right, so it's a good exercise to go through once you've been through a discovery. Look at the scenarios that have been generated, okay, and start to take them through this cycle, and you'll find that it gives you room to optimize things still further. All right, cool. All right, thank you guys. That's me pretty much done, really. I wanted to just really wrap up by sharing to me what are the kind of the big three. So as far as further reading, further study, you might say that these are possibly the only books or source material you ever really need. These books are awesome. All right, so BDD in Action. Again, look, Forward by Dan North there, right? So Dan North, the originator, the architect, if you will, of BDD. All right, the Cucumber book. Okay, Matt Wynn, Aslak, and Steve Took. All right, these are the Cucumber architects. Okay, the creators. So these two books go absolutely hand in hand. And this is language agnostic, right? So if you're doing this in Java or JavaScript or Ruby, it's irrelevant, frankly. The content of these books are going to be valuable to you regardless of how you choose to implement. And then finally, related but not directly so, Spec by example. This is by Gojko Adzig. This is an awesome book that we've talked a little bit about examples today, but taking an example and then actually driving it, asking the what if questions by inserting different values. So we are driving a specification or a scenario with the use of examples and saying, if I use this particular example, is my outcome going to be any different? All right. So in very high level loose terms, but these three books together would be a fantastic investment on your part. Okay. So I'm going to close there. So guys, thank you so much for your time. As I say, we've worked with BDD for 10 years now on many deliveries. We are absolutely bought into the process. It's a core part with the use of Cucumber of our automation solution now. Okay, so you can find us at testevolve.com, see us on github.io. And we do offer a free 90-day evaluation, as we always will do. All right, so we have a really nice web test recorder that integrates fully with BDD features and scenarios. Okay, so if you're looking for an accelerator to explore this, start recording some tests for the first time, then look us up, give us a go, and we'd be only too happy to talk to you about what you're trying to do and how we might be able to help you. All right, so I hope you found this useful. If you have, maybe give us a thumbs up, subscribe, give us a like. We're going to be firing out lots more content in this space. Okay, so thank you very much, and I hope to speak to you soon. Cheers.